I don't know about you, but my favorite segments of the daily news shows are the so-called human interest stories. Those stories about people who exhibit extraordinary grace or strength or courage or tenacity in the face of adversity. These stories are for me a source of hope and inspiration when so much of what the world deems newsworthy is anything but hope-giving or hopeful. Just this week, I happened upon one such story that seemed particularly fitting for today's sermon. The story focused on a young man from Washington, D.C. who is pursuing his dream of higher education through the gift of music. His name is Anthony Anderson, and he considers himself lucky even if everything in his life hasn't always been that way. When he was 3, Anthony's father was killed in a drive-by shooting. That alone could have easily derailed any dreams Anthony or his family had for his future, but it didn't. Along the way, Anthony learned to speak German and Italian, all a part of an unusual dream. Something inside Anthony, you see, drew him to opera. I don't get it. It's certainly a genre of music that's not often pursued by young African American males, that's for sure. But last year, after being one of the few in his family to actually attend college, Anthony was forced to drop out after just 1 year because he couldn't afford a tuition. The dream, it seemed, had come to an end. But Sylvia Twine, the choral director at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in D.C., had another idea. She invited Anthony to come perform, to do a concert at her church. His performance so touched those in attendance that night they raised $40,000, enough to pay for another year's tuition. But that wasn't the end of the story, because soon afterwards several universities heard about Anthony's story and his amazing talent. And before long he received scholarship offers from Juilliard, the Oberlin Conservatory of Music, Duquesne University, and others. When the story aired, Anthony had not yet made a final decision about which school he'll be attending next year. But one thing seems certain. Even though there have been many times in this very improbable journey that Anthony's been on that he could have simply thrown up his hands and said, impossible. No way. It's just not going to happen. He didn't. And now this seemingly impossible dream of traveling the world and sharing his music is well on the way to being realized. Luke 1:26-38 is a story of the angel's announcement to Mary, a story itself fraught with the seemingly impossible. A virgin having a child, and not just any child, but God's child. Joseph deciding to follow through on their engagement and marry her once he understands that Mary is pregnant. Mary avoiding the humiliation and the possibility even of death when the neighbors find out. Elizabeth, who we talked about last week, conceiving and giving birth to a child in her old age, something so impossible that the news left Zechariah speechless. This is a story of how the impossible, how the no way can't happen, becomes possible with God. And while the story is, yes, about people long ago and far away, isn't it also our story as well? Isn't that the meaning, the hope of the incarnation of God become one of us, God with us, in Jesus the Christ, the baby born in Bethlehem? I mean, how many times do we find ourselves with the same troubled, perplexed, confused mind of Mary, struggling with the seemingly impossible, asking the same question she asked? How will this happen? How can it be? How can this situation be resolved? How can this relationship possibly be restored? How can I overcome my past? How can I find emotional healing? How do I find release from this crippling addiction that's got its claws in me? How do I find health and wholeness in the wake of my diagnosis? How do I go on without him? How do I go on without her when the hole is so big and I feel so empty? How do I start over when I've lost everything to the flood, the fire? How can our church reach our community and make a difference in our world when we're so small and our resources so limited? How can we ever hope for world peace when we can't even get along with those in our own family, with our co-workers, our neighbors, when various factions within our own denomination can't even agree to disagree in Christian love? When the leaders of our state, our nation, seem incapable of civil discourse or mutual respect? When they can't put aside ideological differences to work together for the greater good? World peace? Really? You got to be kidding, right? No way. Won't happen. Impossible. I think the question we're really asking in each of these situations and others like them is how the seemingly impossible is possible with God. And I think we find our answer, at least in part, in Mary's response to the angel in this morning's passage. Especially when it comes to this whole idea of peace, whether it be our peace or peace on a broader scale. Let me explain. In the story, Mary, a young girl probably about 13 years of age, finds herself in an impossible predicament. As I noted earlier, in her culture, being pregnant before marriage could have resulted in a severely humiliating or possibly deadly sentence for Mary, especially if Joseph had decided to reject her and decided not to go through with the marriage that was already planned. Not surprisingly, her first response is, "How can this be? How can this happen? What?" Now, I'm pretty sure I would not have been quite so calm. Y'all can laugh. Go ahead. You know I would not have been not quite so calm. You know that's not my first response to the unexpected. What's interesting, though, I think, is how quickly it seems Mary moves from that state of surprise and denial, how can this be, how can this happen, into a place of relative acceptance. You know, it is what it is. Okay, God, do with me as you please. For me, that's nothing short of miraculous, since I'm obviously not good at that at all. Another possibility is maybe Mary didn't transition from the denial to the acceptance quite as quickly as those few verses of Scripture say. I mean, think about it. In some ways, Scripture is often a Reader's Digest condensed version of the things that happen. So maybe Mary had a little more time to ponder and to work out the confusion and the surprise that she felt at this announcement from this angel, this messenger of God, before she agreed to let God do with her as God chose. I'm thinking that's probably more likely. But anyway, either way, relatively short span of time, Mary goes from how can this be to let it be so with me, right? And again, that's truly amazing for me, because sometimes it takes me years to get from here to here. But Mary seems to be able to do that. And I think it's important here to understand that in all of this, Mary had a choice. I think we sometimes wonder about that. Could Mary have said no? I think Mary could have said no. I think Mary could have said no, and then God would have chosen someone else. So Mary had a choice, like we do. We have a choice always in how we respond to difficult situations in our life, do we not? We may not think we have a choice, but really we always have a choice in the sense of how we respond. We may not have a choice in what happens in our lives. We might not have a choice in the turmoil or the injustice or the tragedy that comes or the unexpected that comes, but we have a choice, at least in the sense of how we respond. So Mary had a choice. I think that's important to note. But what's also important is this ability of hers to move from that how can it be state of denial to this let it be sense of acceptance of what God is. Because when she does that, as when we do that, God, it allows God to use Mary, it allows God to use us in powerful ways, does it not? Because Mary could move from that denial, how can it be, to that let it be of acceptance, God used her to literally change the world through the birth of her son Jesus, the Christ. But then how does that, again, translate for us? What does it mean for us in our quest for peace on a personal or a larger level? And I invite you to think about it this way. If you're a lot like me or anything like me, you may spend a lot of time wishing that things were not the way they actually are. You know, things happen in life, and I waste way too much time and energy bemoaning the fact that this happened this way or that happened that way. I kind of live in that denial a lot, or I live somewhere in between denial and acceptance. And then that affects everything that I do. But one of the things I'm learning slowly, the older I get, is that wishing things were different doesn't change the situation at all. Our ability, though, to creatively see how God might be working even in the most undesirable situation is diminished when we spend that energy on denial, or if we just passively wait for things to change. Again, something I'm not good at. You can just ask my family, for one. Some of you know, many of you know, the story of how my mom and sister came to live with me 11 and a half years ago. Mom has a habit of falling, it seems. And 11 and a half years ago, she fell down the stairs and suffered a traumatic brain injury, and her recovery was remarkable. But in the time of that not knowing, we made the decision that we would all get a house together, and that way I could help care for her and Crystal if needed. Now, I have to tell you, at 44 years of age, that was not on my radar. That was not something I wanted. And I'm pretty sure it's not something my mother wanted either. And she's not here to defend herself, so I'll just say that I don't think she wanted that any more than I did. So it was kind of a big thing for all of us. And I have to tell you, that first year or so, I spent a lot of time in that denial stage of how can this be? Whoa, wait, God, this is not the way I pictured my life to be at this point in my life. And so, you know, I pouted. I felt sorry for myself. I acted in self-destructive ways. I was resentful. I wasn't nice. I didn't accept it very graciously. But, you know, as a therapist pointed out to me, I had a decision in all of that. This wasn't something that was just thrust upon me. I made the decision to live with my mom and sister. I mean, I could have said, no, go to a home. I mean, it would have been pretty heartless. I'm not sure y'all would have kept me as your pastor if I'd done that. But I did have a decision. And I think this is important to know in all of this. We have a decision how we respond. And so my choice was to respond, but then I acted like I didn't have a choice. Does that make sense? And so I was really kind of a jerk for a long time. And Crystal, where's Crystal? Well, I wasn't always nice, right?
Not always.
It was difficult. But I had a choice, and I had to come to learn, to not be resentful of what had happened, to embrace that choice, and to make the best out of what was really not an ideal situation for any of us. None of us wanted to be in that place, but it was what it was. And here's the thing where I see God working. If we are able to move from denial to acceptance, God can work even in those situations that we wouldn't readily embrace. It was only because of the fact that we were all living together, that we had the house that we had, and I had their support, that when the opportunity 3 years later to adopt Hunter came along, that I was able to do that. As a single mom, as a pastor of a church, there is no way on earth I could have adopted a child and done justice to that child if I had been on my own. I just couldn't have. So it's kind of like when we finally got to that acceptance stage, God worked in that situation that none of us wanted to begin with and kind of redeemed it all. Does that make sense? So back to Mary. Mary had a choice. God comes to her and says, hey, Mary, you've been honored. Oh, yeah, right. That's a great honor, God. Got you. 13 years old, not married yet, and I'm going to have your baby. Let me explain that one to my friends. But you found favor with God, the angel says. You are going to be honored to have God's son. And Mary's like, oh, no, wait. How can this be? And she spends some time in that denial. But Mary was able to move into the acceptance and finally says, let it be so. And she embraced what God was doing in her life. It's not what she envisioned for her life, I'm pretty sure. Maybe not even what she wanted, but she embraced it, even knowing later on it would cause her even more heartache when she watched that baby grow into a man and be rejected and killed for being who he was. And I've totally lost where I was. I guess to say, all of that to say, sometimes things happen in life that are unjust. They're not fair. There's no way we can wrap our minds around them and make them into God's will. But if we open ourselves to God's working in the midst of even things that aren't what we want, God can see us through to a blessing on the other end. We may not have any idea what that blessing will look like, but I think if we remain open and we allow God to work in us and accept it for what it is, we accept those things we cannot change, then God can bless us as God blessed Mary, and then perhaps we can take that thing in our life and turn it into a blessing for someone else. You know, in the beginning story, I talked about Anthony Anderson, and he was 3 years old in D.C., probably not living in the best part of town. His dad was killed when he was 3 years old in a drive-by shooting. He could have let that wreck his whole life. But his family and he chose a different path. And they chose to respond in a more positive way. And he took that and I'm sure used that as motivation to make use of the gifts God had given him in a very unusual and creative way. A way that will, I'm sure, bless the world for years to come. Mary did that, I believe, by accepting God's direction in her life and working with God to bless others. I think peace begins with us. I tried to say that in the children's sermon. Even world peace begins with us. And peace comes when we accept what is and then are able to channel our energy in positive ways to live into the possibility of what's next. Even when we're in a place that we don't want to be and we got there by things that other people did and we don't want to happen. But if we can accept it and find that sense of acceptance, we can choose to channel the energy away from denial and all those other negative things and into a positive way of being vessels of God's love and hope and peace in a world, folks, that needs it so very much. In this story, Mary is called favored by the angel. And I guess from the hindsight of 2020, we can all say that she was indeed favored. But I also know that in the midst of difficult situations, it's much harder to see that blessing that is yet to be. And again, like I've said to you, it's something I'm not very good at. You know, this whole passage I found stepping on my toes a lot. It was really meddling in areas of my life that still, to this day, need lots of work and lots of improvement. Obedience, I think, is our moving toward God in what God wants our response in any given situation to be. It's accepting what is and looking for the blessing God can provide, even when the situation is not what we would have wanted. And peace comes with that acceptance and that decision to be open to God's working. And then we become like Mary and like Elizabeth, messengers of the good news and the peace to other people. Mary became the mother of a Savior, the one who would announce, who would bring wholeness and healing to his people, that God with us presence that we celebrate at Christmas, the divine presence in and among God's people in a very particular way in Jesus the Christ. How is God working in your life to bring possibility out of what may seem an entirely impossible or improbable situation? Can you set aside your anger, your denial, your hurt, your fear, whatever it is that keeps you from hearing God at work, long enough to see, to glimpse, to imagine the possibility of a future that God has envisioned for you, even in the midst of turmoil? Does that make sense? Thanks be to God. Amen.